United States didn't have the horsepower, which resulted in a total collapse of the Russian economy and created a lot of distress in the country. During the time I was Foreign Secretary, the American ambassador Blackwell used to knock on my door to press India also not to join the ICC. There's no Jaishankar doctrine.
It's the Modi doctrine.
It's the Modi doctrine.
Yes.
But Jaishankar is expressing it very well.
The following is a conversation with the former Indian Foreign Secretary and respected and renowned and very accomplished former diplomat, Dr. Kanwal Sibal. Subscribe now and enjoy the conversation. Dr. Sibal, thank you so much for doing this podcast and for hosting us so graciously in this wonderful place. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
So I would like to discuss geopolitics with you. And there is so much that's happening in the world right now. The entire geopolitical scenario is under flux. It's in a state of flux. It's realigning. So let us begin with the most important and powerful nation, which is the United States. So the US has taken quite a journey in the past 30 years. It was the sole superpower after the breakup of the USSR. And now people talk about whether the US is declining or not. So are these reports of the decline of the US highly exaggerated, or is there some truth to it, sir?
It's a question of relativity, if you like. US still remains the foremost global power, no doubt about it. Militarily, no country can compete with it, though mind you, the irony is that they lost most of the wars that they engaged in. Yes. They have God knows how many bases all around the world. They have military alliances spread over. They have the most powerful navy in the world, which gives them the capacity to intervene where they like and when they like. And then, of course, they have this agenda of shaping the world according to their values, so-called, and market principles and what suits them most in terms of linkages with the global economy. And they use the dollar as a very powerful weapon. And that again is the source of great American power, which cannot be easily replaced. It is the status of dollar as the world's reserve currency. It's the biggest economy in the world. Therefore, all countries, when they want to hedge against the future, find it safe to invest either in the United States or in the US dollar. So that gives them strength. However, relative to what their position was, let's say after the collapse of the Soviet Union, certainly there is a decline in inverted commas of US power because China has come up in a very big way, in such a big way that it is now openly challenging US power. If you look at the kind of exchanges they have, they teach lessons, the Chinese teach lessons to the Americans about their system, about their policies, about their hegemony, and have already announced, Xi Jinping that is, in their various documents, what their goals are, and they've set timelines for that, of becoming a middle-income country, which they already have become, then becoming a technologically advanced country by a certain date, and eventually by 2049, to be at the center of global governance, which is a code word of either sharing power with the United States or replacing the United States. And the United States doesn't know how to handle China. Because look at their trade figures, $600-700 billion. In fact, I was looking at the figures. I forget the exact figures. Their trade in 2022 increased by about $50-60 billion compared to the previous year, despite all the talk about delinking or decoupling and resilient and trustworthy supply chains and stuff like that. Their Treasury Secretary and their leaders have said very clearly, there's no question of decoupling from China. We want to do de-risking, which means in select areas, they'll move out of China. But the basic structure of the trade exchanges cannot be easily modified because of the interdependence they've created. I'm saying all this because who has built up China? It's the United States of America on false assumptions. Actually, not even on false assumptions, on very self-serving assumptions. Now, how could the United States openly say that they are going to collaborate with communist China? They started with Mao, and then they had all these leaders. It's the Chinese Communist Party. And if the United States says that their mission in the world is to spread democracy then is it consistent with building up a powerful, centralized communist dictatorship? Which they did. And this argument that, once China becomes richer, there is a middle class, they'll move towards democracy, it was all self-serving. This was just to counter criticism from any circle as to why they were dealing so closely with the communist power by saying, no, if we do that, then maybe they will not be communist anymore, or they'll be less communist. This was just a cover. Now, it's not only that. Because America reached out to China and built it up, then the allies of China, of the United States, also joined the game. Japan, look at Japan. Whatever they say today about threat from China, their biggest economic partner is China. And the Japanese economically cannot survive if they break off economically from China. South Korea, again, like Japan, a military ally of the United States, its biggest economic partner is China. Then, of course, the ASEAN. Japan, in past years, linked the ASEAN economy with the Japanese economy, and in fact helped very importantly in the build-up of ASEAN as an economic unit. Now China has moved in. The biggest partner of ASEAN is China. And within ASEAN, there are allies of the United States of America. And then China, and that's important. You see, the United States used the World Bank, the IMF, the Washington Consensus, the power of its economy, and everything else to spread its economic tentacles all over the world. And this whole business about pressing other countries to go for export-led economies. The reason was that they thought that they could buy all these exports from other countries at exchange rates which they can always manipulate because the dollar is the reserve currency. You've seen how the depreciation of rupee or another currency vis-a-vis the dollar. And this is to feed the consumption in the United States at the lowest prices possible. Now, China is giving them a run for their money with the BRI. So they are everywhere in the world, and they have shown their capacity to build infrastructure rapidly and high quality. And they are building infrastructure in Africa or Latin America or ASEAN and elsewhere, where United States has not. Because the United States approach has been very, very different. Access to raw materials and stuff like that, but not actual developmental projects. For example, even with India, now of course today the situation is different. They didn't want to cooperate with the private sector, with the public sector, only with the private sector. But in the African countries and all, there is no real private sector. So they have to go with the government, which they've always been reluctant to do. Yes, through the World Bank and all, they have been doing projects. But World Bank has very stringent rules. They try to eliminate corruption and stuff like that. But China doesn't care. They'll build ports and harbors and railway lines and roads and other forms of infrastructure, buildings and stuff like that. They corrupt the elites and they get these contracts. So they are present everywhere. And then countries like Africa, what do they say today? Look, we've been colonized by the West. The West lectures us on human rights and stuff like that, interferes in internal relations, but China does not. China builds infrastructure for us. It doesn't have any colonial past. Therefore, why should we be against China? Now, this kind of logic, which is now spreading globally, is at the cost of US power. Because other countries feel now they have an alternative they can lean on, which is why you find that so many countries now want to join the SCO. So many want to join BRICS because they want an alternative. They want to escape from the straitjacket in which they have been kept all these years post the Second World War and hedge against external pressures from the West and have alternative options and then play both sides. So in that sense, yes, the US power relative to the others is not as potent as before. And then what has also damaged the US reputation is that they lost the war in Iraq. They had to move out of Iraq. The Iraqi government said, we don't want you in the bases anymore. They refused to have an agreement with them. They moved out of Afghanistan in a way that doesn't add to their reputation. If you see the scenes, what happened. Yes. They had this war on terror, which they began, as a result of which they destroyed Iraq and what have you. And also expelled the Taliban from Afghanistan. And then what happened at the end? They handed over Afghanistan back to the Taliban.
It took them 20 years to hand power to the Taliban back from the Taliban.
Now other countries see this, that America may be very strong, but it is not capable any longer of having its way. Which is why, to answer your question, yes, there is a relative decline of US power. But then to say that, or to exaggerate it to the point that United States is no longer the preeminent power would be a mistake. It still remains the preeminent power, but I think with the rise of India also, there will be a power shift.
So what are your views on the policy, the Jaishankar doctrine, the policies of Dr. Jaishankar?
No, don't say that. Because if you said that, then you will say that there is no Modi doctrine.
The Jaishankar Modi doctrine.
No, there is no Jaishankar doctrine.
It's the Modi doctrine.
It's a Modi doctrine.
Yes.
But Jaishankar is expressing it very well. Initially, he was a bit hesitant, I think. But after we came under pressure on Ukraine and oil and everything else and being lectured to, he's hit back very effectively, very effectively. I think he's doing a great job. He's very widely respected, mind you.
Yes.
I can tell you that some foreign ambassadors I've spoken to say that we wish he were our country's foreign minister. There is some criticism in our own circle, not in our own circles, meaning my circles, but in Indian circles, that he is a bit outspoken and that he is alienating the West. But these are those kind of circles who want to bow down towards the West. But what he's saying is very rational, very rational. Even now, the other day, when Joseph Borrell, the EU foreign policy chief, talked about some kind of action against India for selling refined Russian oil to Europe, in a question in Brussels, he read out from the guidelines of the European Council itself, which said that moment that Russian oil is transformed in another country, it is no longer Russian oil and can be bought. He's very alert. Very alert. And some of his things that, all the world's problems become, Europe thinks that all the world problems, or something like that.
All Europe's problems are the world's problems. The world's problems aren't Europe's problems. Yes.
So that has been being quoted again and again. Yeah. I think he's been ticking off Pakistan and Bilawal Bhutto very effectively. Yes. He thinks through and he formulates his thinking very well. He's not. He explains very rationally what our position is, and I think therefore, to my mind, he's doing a very good job.
Did the US miss a trick in the 1990s? The USSR collapsed, disintegrated. Then the US dealt with socialist regimes worldwide. Yugoslavia, as an example, they broke up the Yugoslavia, and then the USSR was the successor state was Russia, and it was in the hands of Boris Yeltsin, who was very pro-West. Did they miss a trick by failing to destroy the Russian power altogether? With the rise of Putin, the power of Russia started slowly consolidating again and rebuilding. So should they have taken the opportunity to end Russia as a threat once and for all?
Well, their approach was different, which was to get a hold of Russian raw materials, Russian resources, move Russia into a market economy according to the recipes that they have. which resulted in a total collapse of the Russian economy and created a lot of distress in the country. Like they did in Iraq in a different way. They disbanded the Ba'ath, Ba'ath party altogether, with the result that the structures of the country disappeared and led to instability and terrorism. In Russia, it's not the same story, but once you break down the structures of an established economy very, very quickly, it will cause a lot of distress. This resulted in the rise of the oligarchs and everything else, and the looting of the economy, the Russian economy. And Yeltsin was a bit of a drunkard.
Yes.
He was not all there.
Yeah.
And they exploited it, but even Yeltsin started complaining. And then what the mistake they committed, I won't say it's a mistake. It was a very well designed policy that today Russia may be down, tomorrow it may not be down. It's the largest country in the world with huge resources, energy resources in particular, but others too, nuclear power, space power. So how then to make sure that the transatlantic area is protected from the resurgence of Russian power? So why not take the opportunity to do two things? Expand NATO, and in tandem, expand the economic union. Reason being that this served America's purposes in both ways. On the security side, they would have ensured through this policy that NATO was the centerpiece of European security, and they control NATO. And the expansion of the European Union also meant that Russia will be pushed further and further away from Europe economically. And then through NATO and the security control that the United States has over Europe, they will also be able to, in a sense, control the European economy. You see, the biggest challenge the European Union has faced, even today, that despite all the tussles they have in various critical areas with the United States, and now with the CHIP Act and Inflation Reduction Act, they're very, very worried. But what choice do they have? Once you are dependent on the United States for your security, then this limits your choices, which is why they are following dutifully in line with Russian policy against Ukraine. It was in the interest of the United States to have the Baltic states, of course, but countries like Poland and others, to join the European Union. Because the Polish diaspora, Ukrainian diaspora now, is very, very powerful and strong in the United States and Canada. And they very big push in terms of making these countries part of the European Union and, of course, NATO. And now you see what is happening. The United States and Britain now, since it is no longer in the European Union, they are building up what Rumsfeld had said, New Europe versus Old Europe. So Poland is being built up as a counter to the France-Germany tandem, which has been the centerpiece of the European Union. So all this serves United States interests. So the expansion of NATO was a deliberate act, despite the promises given to Yeltsin and to Gorbachev and later to Yeltsin, that NATO initially that it will not move an inch eastward of Germany, and then trying to make the Russians swallow the bitter pill by saying that, okay, we'll create a Russia-NATO Council, so where we can discuss all these matters as a kind of a SOP, that you are part of the process. Mm-hmm. So Russia was too weak to resist until Putin came to power. But even Putin in the initial years wanted actually to have an understanding with the European Union, a deal with the European Union. But the European Union said, you have to come to us on the same conditions as other countries which want to join the European Union, which is that you have to modify your internal economic, political, legal systems and stuff like that. Because there's a lot of waiting time for other countries. And the Russians said, look, we are not Bulgaria or countries like that. We are Russia. So we have to deal with each other equally, which means that they never really got to move forward on some kind of a trade agreement, or not a trade agreement, some kind of a larger agreement between the European Union and Russia. And with regard to Europe in general, Putin, I remember, was saying that we are a European country, our future is with Europe, and that if we remain in Europe, if we are linked to Europe, it will be a guarantee of Russian democracy. He had that thinking too, until, of course, they rebuffed him left, right, and center. Yes. And in 2007, he made that speech at Munich. I was ambassador to Russia then. And I analyzed that speech, and there was a lot of merit in his speech. And that was the breaking point. But nevertheless, he still, while opposing the West, tried to maintain a degree of equilibrium towards the West. But the West was very contemptuous. Look at what Obama said, that you're just a regional power. In fact, he said, and I was amazed at that time that he said this, that there are three problems facing the world: terrorism, Ebola, and Russia. This is the kind of contempt. And he made personal contemptuous remarks against Putin, saying he's like a schoolboy with an attitude who sits at the back of the room, the back of the class, things like that. So there it is. I think, the other thing is, which I studied that a little bit. Their game plan during the Yeltsin years was to get hold of 30% of Russia's energy sector. Yes. That's why all the big companies, American companies, moved in a very big way. You can see still photographs of Tillerson with Putin and stuff like that. Anyway, when Putin came back to power, he done his PhD on Russia's energy sector, so he knew exactly. He's very well informed about Russia's energy sector. Incidentally, that's why Khodorkovsky and everything else, that the entire affair where his company was taken over by Russia, in which even the Harvard University had shares. It was a huge issue because of that. It was taken over by Rosneft. So Putin, from his point of view, rightly said that they want to take hold of the biggest jewel in our economy. We won't let them do it. And while they were still present and they were still collaborating, but he reorganized Russia's energy sector, created these new state-owned players who then were able to resist this American encroachment and actually hemmed in the oligarchs so that they could not be tools for Western companies to actually infiltrate into Russia's energy sector beyond a certain point. After the sanctions were announced, the company has moved out, as also other American companies. I see. So to answer your question, United States didn't have the horsepower to actually dismantle Russia after the Soviet Union had collapsed. They thought that they could, from the inside, control Russia and get access to their raw materials and resources, etc., etc. Plus, of course, they were able to get hold of certain very advanced sectors of the, I won't say take hold, they were able to get technological know-how from Russia in certain sectors in Russia is very advanced. I see. So, space, for instance. And then with the NATO expansion, they thought they could control Russia. Now that brings me to another historical thing which is of interest in the context of the discussion we are having. If you read Brzezinski's book, he had said that for America to remain the world's preeminent global power, they have to do two things. Three things he said, the third I can't recall. Two things. One is that to de-link Ukraine from Russia, because then Russia will cease to be a European power. Okay. And secondly, control the rise of China. Okay. And I think the third was the Islamic world terrorism, something like that. So this has been long in the strategic thinking of the United States that Ukraine has to be delinked. And they began working on this after Ukraine became independent very steadily till in 2014. They succeeded in overthrowing the legitimately elected government of Yanukovych, in which Victoria Nuland publicly was in the Maidan distributing cookies, McCain also. So anyway, that's another part of the story. But what I meant is that this was the grand design of weakening Russia, of isolating Russia from Europe, pushing its frontiers as far away from Europe proper, if you like. And in a sense, it was a different version of the containment policy of the United States against the Soviet Union.
So the US is, well, it positions itself as the world's guardian of democracy and the biggest proponent of democracy. The US is a two-party state, which is a step above a one-party state. And recently it's come in the news, I think it's the New York Times that reported it, that the Biden administration was planning to send a dossier of alleged Russian war crimes to the International Criminal Court. And the Pentagon blocked the Biden administration from doing this. So what does this tell us? Is the Pentagon actually more powerful than the White House in the US?
Well, the flaw in this, these reports is that the United States is not a member of the International Criminal Court. And in fact, during the time I was Foreign Secretary, the American ambassador Blackwell used to knock on my door to press India also not to join the ICC. And we of course had our own reason, but they wanted us to accept their reasons for not joining, and our reasons were different. So I told them that we will not join the ICC, but not for the reasons that you're saying. We have our own reasons. I don't want to go into that. They were very concerned that their military will be hauled up for war crimes, Afghanistan and everywhere, wherever. Iraq, especially Iraq, Abu Ghraib and stuff like that. So Russia also didn't join. China didn't join. We haven't joined. So not being members of the ICC and then giving them dossiers on Russian war crimes is a contradiction. What will be their basis for doing that? That is one. The other is that the Europeans are doing this job in any case. First, okay, let me just go back a little bit. The fact that an ICC warrant has been issued against Putin and that head of the Children's Foundation in Russia was maneuvered just before Xi Jinping's visit to Russia. And certainly this was a move in which America and Britain especially, and Poland and others, and the Baltic states had a big hand because they know that once the warrant is issued, it can never be reverted. So it'll be a constant pressure on Russia and President. So if there's any truth in these reports that the United States wanted to do that, it would be extremely cynical, especially as when the head of the ICC, the previous one, actually wanted an investigation done into U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan. The U.S. government said that they will blacklist and sanction the ICC itself and the judges who participate in this.
Okay.
So, but then, once you are the biggest power in the world, then contradictions don't matter. But to answer your question, I don't think that Pentagon is more powerful than the White House. It's a collective decision that they take. Pentagon's at times certainly seems more conservative in policy recommendations, whereas the politicians, the White House, National Security Council, State Department, they may take a more adventurous view. So the Pentagon is a very, very powerful force in the U.S. system, but at the end of the day, It's the White House.
Okay.
That determines these things.
Now, coming to Russia, we currently have President Putin, who's been in power for a significant amount of time. Mr. Medvedev was president for a while, but it was always Mr. Putin who held the reins of power. The question is, how long can Mr. Putin remain as president? He is also past 70, if I'm not mistaken. And obviously, at some point in time, there will have to be a transition to somebody else. And typically, if we study history, civilizations and empires collapse because the transfer of power goes wrong and the successor isn't good enough. Is there anybody on the horizon post-Putin? Do you see anybody who could emerge in the future?
Very difficult to say. Medvedev, of course, is there. He was president earlier. He was prime minister. Now he is the, I think, head of their, in the Kremlin head of, I don't know exactly what his title is, but he's got a very, very powerful position.
Yes.
And there is Patrushev, who's the head of the National Security Council. These are the names people bandy about. But you can never say who will emerge as a successor. Putin will have a big say in this if and when he decides that he is not going to continue to fight elections and be president. I think he's yet not announced whether next year or whenever the election is due that he'll be a candidate, but I think he will. I think he will. That's one part. The other is that these are very speculative questions, and at the end of the day, they don't mean anything very much. You know, when Nehru died, everybody thought, who after Nehru, who after Nehru? So now we found a solution internally. There may have been an interregnum where after especially Rajiv Gandhi passed away, these coalition governments and this and that. But we have a very strong government today. So I think nations find a solution. So I don't think, for people outside, it is always an interesting question to ask because they don't know enough about domestic politics and personalities to be able to make a good judgment. And then in any case, in countries like Russia or China especially, the political structure is such that the man at the top will not build an alternative.
Correct.
Because once you build an alternative, then you build the possibility of replacement.
Yes.
On the other hand, if you look at United States of America, Biden is there, a lot of doubts about him, his leadership.
Yes.
And he's going to fight the election again. And he'll be past 80.
Yes.
When, 83 or something, when the next term finishes, if he gets elected.
Yes.
Also ask the question after Biden, who, and after, I mean, these kind of questions can always be asked. But there is a system.
Yes.
There is a structure. And a solution would be found internally. Immediately, it's possible it may not be the best solution. After all, Medvedev made a big error when he abstained on the UN Security Council resolution on Libya. And allowed the operation to take place. Because Medvedev always had the image of being more pro-Western.
Okay.
And Putin put him in place as president so as to have a kind of a balance where he would resist the West and Medvedev will reach out to the West.
Okay.
Medvedev has become today very harsh, extremely harsh in his criticism of America and Europe after the Ukraine. Okay. Very harsh. So let's see.
Right. How do you see Ukraine going, the Ukraine conflict? It's been over a year. And initially, people were saying that Putin would steamroll Ukraine in a week's time. That's not happened. The battle lines are kind of stagnant right now. The Bakhmut meat grinder operation is going on. And we don't see much of the the borders, the line of control changing. So who do you think is winning? Who has the upper hand right now? Are the Russians losing? I mean, the Western media has been saying the Russians are losing, they are withdrawing for the past year. But that's clearly not the case. They control roughly a fourth of the country. What do you think is going to happen? Is Ukraine going to become another North Korea or that sort of thing, partition nation? Or do you think the Russians will eventually want to take over the whole nation?
See, Putin was never gung-ho for this war at all. After all, he was a signatory to the Minsk agreements.
Yes.
And the Minsk agreements were ratified by the UN Security Council. But they were not implemented.
Yes.
And now Merkel says, and Francois Hollande says that there was really no intention to implement them, but to give time to Ukraine to build up its military strength. But he waited 7 years.
Yes.
And the fact is that Donbass was under attack by the Ukrainian forces, shelling, killing the civilian population, who are Russian.
Yes.
And actually, who had always resisted both Ukraine joining NATO and also joining the European Union. Now, if you look at what they call European values, Western values, in which protection of ethnic groups and minorities is a very vital element.
Yes.
But why is it that when it came to the ethnic minority, Russian minority in Ukraine, nobody was terribly concerned that their rights had to be protected and the Ukrainian government had to be told. Now, to do that, if they had implemented the Minsk agreements, there would be no conflict today because Russia made it very clear that the Donbass will remain part of Ukraine, and but the Ukrainian constitution will be changed, which will allow autonomy to these regions. And after the constitution is amended, then elections will take place in these areas. And once that's done and local governments are elected, then the Ukrainian army can move to the Russian frontier, which means that the sovereignty of Ukraine would have been respected.
Yes.
But this was not acceptable to the West and to the, I don't know whether the Ukrainians were accepting this or not accepting this, is very unclear. I mean, the present government.
Yeah.
So probably not. In the meantime, after 2014, if you really look at what's happening on the ground, NATO effectively, the West effectively, has been present on the ground, training the Ukrainian military, arming them. Without Ukraine becoming de facto a member of NATO, NATO increased its visibility and presence and involvement in Ukraine. I don't know if this is factually true or not, but I'm told that the majority of the Ukrainian parliament members have dual nationality.
I see.
Yes, they are largely American. Which is why, if you notice on our television channels, whenever people from Ukraine came and spoke, they spoke very good English. And when the Russians appeared, they were not very articulate because they're not fluent in English.
Right.
The American companies, though so they say, have bought land, including farms and everything else, mining sector, everything else. So they're very deeply entrenched there. Anyway, to come back to your precise question, Russia and Putin said that I have been talking to you, telling you of my concerns, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, you not listen to me. And he said, look, before he sent his troops, that let's agree on a security architecture. And he made a proposal, very detailed proposal, which was rejected by the West. Now, there may have been elements in the proposal which may not have been acceptable to the West, but then you negotiate.
Right.
but they just rejected that. And then he thought that if he made a show of force, then the West may yield. Because he said that also, that you don't take me seriously. So I have to make you take me seriously. Now, he has a problem. A, the war is not popular in Russia. Okay. At the end of the day, they were the same country for 200 years, yes. 300 years, God knows. Yeah, I'll come back to that a little bit. And this largely the same ethnic group, yes. Same religion, Russian Orthodox, intermarriages all over. In fact, when I was in Moscow and I was dealing with the head of their Atomic Energy Agency, the equivalent, and we were negotiating the Kudankulam project. Okay. He was a Ukrainian origin. I see. But of course, when I never thought of him as a Ukrainian, right. He was Russian.
For us, it's the same ethnicity.
Yeah. So that is one. The war is not popular. Number two, if he was really to have a large operation, then he'll have to mobilize, yes. Which would make him unpopular. The younger Russians don't want to get mobilized, don't want to risk their lives, don't want to fight this war. Which is partly the reason why Wagner Group and others are there, because this avoids mobilization of the general public. So, if you put 200,000 troops on any front line, you're not going to be able to conquer that country militarily. Especially Ukraine, is the largest. If you take Western Europe, is the largest country in Western Europe.
Yes. Right.
Huge lines you have to defend. Then you need mobilization of 1 million or more, or something like that, if you really want to. He never had that intention. He wants to my mind, solidify the separate status of the Donbass region and the other regions. Now he's included Zaporizhia and Kherson, Crimea, of course, and defend that. Number three, Russia, now they are admitting they neglected many of the new elements that have entered into modern warfare. Drones and this and that, the electronic stuff. Now they realize, after facing NATO supplied weapons, that they didn't pay enough attention to develop these capacities. Thinking, of course, they're a nuclear power and they're more nuclear weapons than the United States, so nobody will dare challenge them. So to that point, to that extent, it is true that even in the limited area in which they are fighting, they have suffered a lot of casualties and they have not been able to achieve their goals. Part of the reason is that in the 6-7 years before Russia moved in its troops, the Ukrainians have been building up their defenses solidly, aided by advisors. So it's very difficult to dislodge them. And if you go and make a frontal attack, you will lose a lot of people. Right. So therefore, it's a war of attrition. And from the Russian point of view, war of attrition suits them. For the simple reason that their industrial infrastructure has not been touched, will not be touched.
Yes.
On the other hand, Ukraine's infrastructure effectively has been damaged very severely.
Yes.
They don't have enough weapons, ammunition. The West is now openly saying that what we produce, I forget the figures, or something to the effect that what we produce in a year, they sort of consume in a week or so, or something like that. We don't have the capacity to provide them the quantity of ammunition that they are using every day. And I heard Blinken say at the Munich Security Conference that we can ask our defense companies to produce more, but tomorrow if there are negotiations, then what happens to the extra capacity that our companies build up? Yes. And then they know that if they go too far, then they can risk a direct conflict with Russia. That's why they are doing it slowly. They give them HIMARS, they give them tanks, they give them some drones now, and Now they've given them Storm Shadow, cruise missiles. Zelensky keeps saying, give me planes and stuff like that.
Yes.
I don't know if they'll cross that Rubicon because it's getting escalated.
Yes.
And it could lead to a nuclear holocaust if they go on escalating in the manner in which they are. But to come back to what you said, the short answer would be that the Russian army hasn't performed well. But you have to look at the circumstances in which it has been fighting and the reluctance to go in for an all-out war. Because, look, if they really wanted, they would bomb the defense headquarters of Ukraine,
Yes.
their president's office, this and that. They could just raise it to the ground if they wanted. They don't want to do it. They don't want to do it. Even if you look at the grain thing, they have been cooperative because they know they must keep international public opinion, especially developing countries in Africa, behind them. So they agreed to the grain deal, even though part of the deal was that Russian grain will also be allowed to be exported. But the West has made sure under the sanctions regime that this can't be done. But Ukrainian grain can flow. They have accepted that.
Right.
They, in fact, began negotiations with the Ukrainian government in March. And after a month, it was announced that they had almost reached an agreement. And then, of course, the talk is that Prime Minister Johnson at that time rushed to Kiev and said, nothing doing, don't do it. And the Ukrainians walked back because they were promised, we'll give you full support. I think Russian prestige has suffered.
Okay.
But if you take a very broad view, this is also because Russia is a reluctant player in this. They don't want to go in for an all-out war. And last point, which is important, is that they also don't know what shape this war may take place. So they are reserving their most advanced weaponry in case there is a direct standoff with NATO. They don't want to expend this at this stage.
They have kept their entire air force in reserve. They haven't used it, and much more, right? What's your perspective on France? I see France as perhaps the only nation in the EU and NATO that has a kind of a quasi-independent foreign policy. They have their own nuclear submarines with their own warheads on them, unlike the UK, whose nuclear warheads are mated to American missiles, which makes the red button in Washington. How do you see France's foreign policy? Is it an independent actor, unlike the other EU nations?
Not really. See, France has a problem. Now with the United States building up this new Europe against old Europe, they have to preserve their position, which is becoming more and more difficult because Germany has succumbed.
Yes.
They just succumb to American pressure. Yes. Can you imagine the Nord Stream 2 is sabotaged, Nord Stream 1 is sabotaged.
Yes.
German investment in it, German economic interests are deeply involved, and Germany says nothing. Don't even say that let's investigate, let's see who's done it. Nothing. Complete silence. Yeah. And then under pressure from the United States, they try to resist it. They said, you send your Leopard tanks. They said, no, we'll send them if you send your Abrams tanks. Resisted a little bit, but then they succumbed again. And they sent the tanks. Yes. And they are being lectured. Look at the state of Germany today. Yes. They receive lectures from Zelensky. Zelensky humiliates them. Yes. And Poland has asked for $1.2 trillion of damages from the Second World War. Yes. This is the state of Germany. Why I'm saying this is that the Franco-German tandem, which was the heart of the European Union, that has got weakened. Right. That has weakened France. Because France can't go it alone. If you remember when Macron went to China some time ago, yes. He took the German chancellor with him. Because that was a show of strength to China, that Europe is united. Right. This time he didn't take Scholz with him, he took the EU lady van der Leyen with him. Again, to show that EU is united, but it's not the same message.
It's not, yes.
That is one part. The other is that France has to retain its leadership. If it doesn't join the gang, it will be marginalized. Because America is controlling everything. And Britain is playing a very insidious role from the outside because they always wanted the European Union to be weak. And that's why they wanted the expansion of the European Union to dilute the centrality of France and Germany. And now they're very happy. Build up Poland, supply arms to Ukraine, determine the security future of Europe from outside. Not leave it entirely to the Europeans themselves to decide. Now, if France doesn't fall in line, it'll be marginalized. So, and the public opinion has been so brainwashed through the press and think tanks and others, that they will not accept any dissent. So, moment Macron in the past, when he said that at the end of the day, when we have the new security architecture, we have to take Russia's concerns, security concerns in mind, he was blasted by Ukraine, of course, but Europeans and his own press. So Macron plays hot and cold. At one time, he talks about negotiations, that you have to explore that, and he did talk to Putin. He visited Putin also. So to keep the door open. And on the other hand, as in his speech when Zelensky came to France a few days ago, if you read the text, full support to Zelensky, including on the criminal court, set up an ad hoc tribunal, will give you all that you need to defend yourself and stuff like that. That is the second. Third is that because of this situation France is in, where it really no longer can determine European policy, the Russians don't take France seriously enough. They say, well, no point in talking to you. We have to talk to the Americans. It's the Americans who are doing all this. The Americans have to decide. So our interlocutor has to be America, not you. So, in other words, they don't accept France's capacity to move the United States or Europe in general towards some kind of dialogue and diplomacy with Russia. So insofar as the French nuclear deterrent is concerned, now the Russians have put in a spoke in the wheel. Earlier on, all the disarmament negotiations were between Russia and United States. Well, start one, start two, everything. Now the Russians are saying that after the Ukraine conflict and the kind of threats that we are faced with, we don't make a distinction between the American nuclear arsenal and the nuclear arsenal of Europe, especially as US nuclear arms are stationed in Europe. Yes. Therefore, in future disarmament negotiations, it has to be with the transatlantic alliance, which France will never accept. So I think having a nuclear deterrent of their own gives them a certain sense of prestige and protection. But they are not threatened.
They're not threatened.
Threatened either by America or within Europe.
Yes.
Only potential threat is against by Russia. And I don't think they have the horsepower to stand up to Russia in the nuclear domain.
By no means. Yes. How do you see the situation in the position of China? China is it hopes to replace and displace the US eventually as the sole superpower in the world, if not the second superpower. But if you look at the demography of China, it's declining. The total fertility rate after this, the COVID crisis had dropped at a point to 1.1. You need 2.1 for replacement. So China is clearly getting old. The median age, I think, is in the 40s now. By 2050, it will be 58 or 68, I'm not sure. By 2100, the Chinese population is projected to be half of what it is today. And it's going to be a very old population. Is the Chinese century over? Or do you see China still prospering in the long run?
You know, one can always make these predictions or do this modeling and see what it might mean in 100 years. time span. But these are useful exercises to understand what the future holds. But you never know what can happen in between. If you look at the past, less in 1990s, and today, the state of global society, no one could have imagined the kind of things that are happening today. Look at this artificial intelligence, chat GPT and stuff like that, how it's going to, turn upside down the whole functioning of societies. People like Kissinger and others, even Elon Musk, are warning against the grave dangers to society. So you never know what may happen. That is one part. The other is that Japan is still the third largest economy.
Yes.
And when they had these Plaza Accords, I think, 80s, that was the beginning of Japan's decline.
Yes.
But Japan still is the third largest global power, economic power. I think they're managing. They have a problem, but they're managing.
Okay.
China, yes, because of the one-child policy, which they're trying to change, but it's not working on the ground.
Yes.
Their population is aging and productivity will go down. There will be burden on the younger generation to support the older generation. So the growth rates will not be as impressive, as large as they are today. What impact this may have on the governance system, because for the moment, the Chinese public is accepting what may be seen as suppression of freedoms because this Communist Party is promising them prosperity.
Yeah.
There is a question about the legitimacy of the political process in China, looked from the outside. Although the Chinese say that we have a more comprehensive democracy than the West has, but that's a different matter. So if that compact breaks and the Communist Party is not able to provide the people the kind of prosperity that they would be looking forward to, whether the kind of democracy movement we saw in 1989 will get revived, and there may be internal political instability, things like that. These are possibilities one can always keep in mind. But if China, Xi Jinping, by 2049 has a clear ambition, a clear goal, and he's determined to achieve that, then at least until 2049, whatever the demography in China, China will be a formidable power.
Yes,
After that, the same argument can be used against India. Okay, we have 30 years of advantage, but after that advantage, we don't have any longer than what happened to the Indian society. So, I mean, and then the climate change and everything else, God knows what other new challenges society is going to face and how this will impact on global governance and international politics. In general, balance of power in the world. These are all questions one can think about. But why load yourself with such pessimism? Live by the day and be as happy as you can.
Yes, indeed. So, Xi Jinping is very firmly in power. How do you see his governance? He's a very different kind of premier as compared to his predecessors. He instituted what we call the wolf warrior diplomacy after his advent as the president, and he's essentially president for life. How do you see his style of functioning? I mean, some people say that he is irrational. Some people say he's mad. He's appointed all kinds of his inner coterie around him. Is he a good president? Is he taking China in the right direction, in your opinion?
He certainly has captured full power in China. All the Politburo members are his creatures.
Yes.
The earlier collective sort of leadership with Deng Xiaoping had introduced with 2 terms for the general secretary. That has been done away with, and he can be president for life if he so wills. He has, if you look at his speeches he made some years ago, he learned a big lesson from the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he said the Soviet Union collapsed because the party collapsed. There was nothing to hold the country together when the party collapsed. So the party is the fulcrum, the mainstay of China's unity and progress, and hence his tremendous emphasis on party unity, control of the party, and constantly reminding, if you look at his speeches at this 20th People Congress or whatever congresses they keep holding, always wanting the party at the center of everything. He's strengthened the armed forces, he has reorganized the armed forces, created theater commands with emphasis on space-based new technologies, because he sees what capacities America has. And if tomorrow there is a conflict over Taiwan, he knows what his challenges are. He's exhorting the PLA constantly. You must fight to win. You must, that kind of a thing. Result of which, of course, is apart from South China Sea, is Ladakh and pressures on our border. He is now more and more, if you look at his own statements, that of his foreign minister, current one, previously Yang Jiechi, they hit back at the United States. You see the statements by the spokesman of the Chinese foreign ministry, very harsh statements against the United States constantly. On Taiwan, he is very clear that come what may, even if they have to use military force at the end, they will use it. They're biding their time. They're trying to change the balance of power in the Western Pacific. And at any point in time they feel it has moved in their favor, they'll do it. Or at least they threatened to do it. At the same time, he's the one who behind the BRI concept, in order to use China's economic power and its capacities, not only to find new markets, but actually to spread China's geopolitical wings all across the world. And very clear strategy, very clear maritime strategy, buying ports, this and that. They're looking also at bases, if I forget the exact document, but the maritime strategy said that they have also now to think about finding bases in order to protect their lines of communication. I think Pakistan will be the first. Djibouti is already there. Xi Jinping is a Chinese nationalist. He's also going back to the roots of Chinese culture and this and that, unlike the Cultural Revolution, which sort of wanted to destroy the Confucian culture, but he talks about Confucius and everything else. So he's a nationalist in that sense. So, highly centralized, nationalist with tremendous capacities, with footprints all over the world, strong military. What does it add up to? Certainly from India's point of view, it adds up to a big threat.
Yes.
So, and on top of that, if you look at on the economic side, for almost all countries of the world, China is the biggest economic partner.
Yes.
With India, $135 billion of trade, the second largest trade partner, despite our differences.
Yes. Control
over critical supply chains. And then the advances they have made in some areas, artificial intelligence, this face recognition technologies, 5G and stuff like that. They have worked very systematically. They have also grabbed very important positions within the United Nations. 2-3 of the United Nations bodies are headed by Chinese. They play a very big role there in terms of, they've got the UN to approve of their BRI. India is opposing it. So I think for the time being and for the foreseeable future, Xi Jinping will remain a very strong leader. And to say that he may not be irrational, I think would be very wrong appreciation of the man. You can hate the man if you like they hate Putin and say Putin is irrational. But that is your own prejudice speaking. He is very rational from his point of view. And on the ground, he's succeeding. And the remarkable thing is, and I must say this, here is a man who, until before the Ukraine war, especially, was singled out as the biggest threat to US power and everything else. And the whole South China Sea, Indo-Pacific concept, Quad and everything else, AUKUS, were a reaction to his aggressive policies.
Yes.
And suddenly he's become a peacemaker. Huh? America says, no, you must persuade Putin.
Yes.
Huh? And the European Union says, you must persuade Putin. Macron also goes and says, you must persuade Putin to stop this. You are the only country that can do it. And they've got so encouraged by the kind of new profile they have built for themselves, which has drawn attention away from their aggression and everything else, now to be peacemakers in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and now Ukraine. They sent a special envoy to Ukraine and to Russia, as well as some European countries. I've been telling my Western interlocutors that does it make any sense from the Chinese point of view when you ask them to ditch Russia? Two things. One is they know that once you have weakened Russia, finished Russia, defeated Ukraine, China is the next target.
Yes.
Therefore, why should they help you? To help you to actually then deal with China with a freer hand. They're not going to do it.
Yes.
But yes, they know that their own prosperity, because they depend a lot on exports and everything else. It depends on having access to global markets, and sanctions can hurt them much more than they hurt Russia.
Yes.
Russia is totally self-dependent in energy, this and that. China is not. So they have to balance it, that they shouldn't do things which at this moment, because they're vulnerable, can actually hurt them badly. So they have to play the game a little bit. But at the same time, in the larger perspective, they know the next target is China.
Yes, right.
So they can't abandon Russia, but they can play a little game here and there to take the heat off them and project themselves as peacemakers. So what surprises me is how the view of the West has changed about China. You say you are my long-term adversary, you are my pacing challenge, you are the ones who will contest my hegemony, but please help me with with Putin in Ukraine. That is one. The other is, why do they need Chinese peacemaking? They can do it themselves.
Yes.
Where's the problem?
Yeah.
They have been talking to the Soviet Union also, when it was the Soviet Union and the Cold War. They've been talking to Russia. So if they want, they can open the doors of dialogue. So they say, no, we don't want peace with Russia. We want to build Ukraine so that it is able to score some military victory on the ground, and then we'll see. But in the meantime, while we don't want peace, you please help us to obtain this peace. I mean, it doesn't make any sense.
Right, indeed. How do you see the China-Russia relationship? We know they've got a very interesting history. The Ussuri River clashes in the 1960s. And these are two very largely contiguous nations, very long shared borders, and that typically causes frictions. The Chinese still haven't given up their claims on Sakhalin and the Russian Far East. Right now they are cooperating, collaborating. Do you see this relationship prospering long term?
Well, firstly, they have signed the border agreement. Yes, this happened while I was in Russia. And it was settled on a fairly even basis. In fact, it's only the Ussuri River and the island in the Ussuri River where they had a deal. And maybe they yielded a little bit on the island by not agreeing, by being flexible about the median line. Okay, these are details. But point is, they settled the border. It is true that Russia's Far East, Sakhalin included, were taken over by the Tsars. But then, if you look at it another way, look at where China's Great Wall is. That was the frontier of China. Beyond that were the barbarians. Now where they are. So Manchuria, the Manchurians are not Hans.
No, they're not.
So China can make the point, yes, these territories were ours, but these territories were part of an empire.
Yes.
And that empire lost to another empire, which was the Tsarist Empire. So there it is. Yes. But you're right that occasionally they publish maps here and there. The other is that on this side of the border, there's huge population on the Chinese side.
Yes.
And on the other side, empty. And there are Chinese who go there, and the Russian administration doesn't object to that because they do farming, this and that. They produce farm products which are needed locally and stuff like that. So they help in they provide manpower for local economic activity. Some of them marry Russian girls, settle down. But when I went to these areas, I went to Sakhalin also. And the impression I got was that there was some kind of a background concern, but nothing immediate. And then I remember Putin making a statement some years ago. Why should China want this territory? They want resources of these territories, but we are giving them the resources. So they're giving them timber, they're giving them this, they're giving them coal and stuff like that. So then at the end of the day, after all, so long as Russia has that military capacity, nuclear capacity, China cannot risk grabbing territory. I don't think that there is any military threat that the Russians feel from China. In fact, they are helping China. After all, China's advancement in military technology is largely Russian. They have reverse engineered so many things. But if you look at the aircraft, they're all copies of Russian aircraft. Space, think they've done wonderful things in space. It's all Russian technology.
The Chinese rocket was a Russian design.
So they're all Russian technology. So if Russia was that afraid, it wouldn't give them all the advanced military technology that they have. But yes, the balance of power between Russia and China has altered. Russia has now accepted that it's not in the same league as China. And their spokespersons and others, their columnists and think tank specialists, admit that China is now the peer of the United States. And Russia is not quite in the same league. Chinese economy is much, much stronger than Russian. Earlier on, in my time, there was still reluctance of Russia to fuel the rise of China by giving it all the energy it needed, because they knew they were building up an economic superpower and helping to build it up. On one side, the United States, on the other side, Russia, by giving them energy, they were hesitant. But now it's totally different. They built a new pipelines, I don't know what they're called, Trans-Siberian. One more pipeline has been agreed. So they are not hesitant now to fuel the Chinese economy because they know they have reached a different league. They are cooperating in the SCO. They have arrived at a kind of a modus vivendi in the Central Asian region, where China dominates economically and Russia dominates from the security point of view. Russia is also eager to get BRI investment, which it has not really got the way it wanted, because China had done this through Central Asia to Europe, but not through Russia. There is, given the history of Russia and the Yellow Peril and the Mongol invasions of the past, that memory is still there. So I don't think that at the popular level, the Russians feel any kinship towards China. But at the strategic level, state level, they know that China has to be a partner, especially in these times when Russia is on the back foot.
How do you see the situation in the Middle East? It's always been in crisis for decades, as long as I can remember. But now that the US influence is declining, the Middle East seems to be stabilizing. There are peace accords. Saudi Arabia, Iran have re-established diplomatic relations. Yemen may be winding down. Israel is talking with its Arab neighbors. How do you see the situation right now?
Well, Middle East was always a very troubled region because it had oil resources. And the West wanted to grab them and keep them under control. Which they succeeded initially when these countries were colonies, and when they sort of divided them artificially into various countries and created, like in the case of India, Pakistan, the reason for perpetual conflict. And then they were the overseers of this conflict, so they could still keep control of their resources, even though these countries nationalized their oil resources and everything else. But for the United States, it was important given the petrodollar connection. And of course, at that time, the United States was still importing oil.
Yes.
Plus also to make sure that energy prices remained at reasonable levels, and that its allies in Europe and elsewhere had access to oil, including Japan. So they had larger interest in the oil politics. Now that they are become themselves an oil exporter, the largest producer of oil in the world, actually, they have moved away strategically from this region. Though, mind you, they have a massive base in Bahrain. The Britain have a massive bases there. The French have a massive base in Abu Dhabi. Britain has a strong presence in Oman. The Americans now have a Sixth Fleet in this region because of Iran threat for the Persian Gulf. I don't know where it actually based. It's based in one of these countries. So it's not as if they have abandoned this region. They're still very much there militarily. But these countries are seeing the writing on the wall. That America is strategic interest in the region has got diluted. And therefore, they have to fend for themselves. That is one aspect. The other, actually more important aspect is not so much China. China has been brought in artificially in this region. Not artificially. In the current peace process, it has been brought in artificially. This peace process began between Iran and Saudi Arabia with the help of Iraq, and then Oman. And then when it was mature enough, they decided that they'll knock on Beijing's door and get Beijing to give it cover. The reason for Saudi Arabia is very, very important to have this peace with Iran is they have seen how vulnerable their entire oil infrastructure is with those very finely targeted drone attacks. And they know tomorrow they can bring their infrastructure down. Now he has this 2030 vision, and he's the Saudi Arabian Crown Prince is developing this Naim called it, this new project it has, real modernization of Saudi Arabia. A part of which, of course, is moving away from Islamism and stuff like that. Now, since he has this huge, massive project, why would investors come in if there is a constant security threat from Iran? So in order to make that project a success and secure Saudi Arabia's future, Saudi Arabia is willing to pay a price, make peace with Iran. But then who guarantees this peace? The United States is not a guarantor anymore. So they run to China, because China is the biggest market for Saudi oil. Plus, China is very strongly interested now in Iran. They've got this $25 billion agreement and stuff. So China would have, therefore, an interest in making sure that things remain stable because of their huge investment in this region. And since they can't, as I said, rely on the United States, they're hoping that China would provide that kind of political, diplomatic cover. The other, of course, is that United States under Trump and even otherwise have always been very, very strong supporters of Israel. And that has always hobbled their policies in the Middle East. Though the Middle Easterns learn to live with it by accepting it unwillingly, that they had no choice. And then they started losing interest in the Palestine issue. which also explains why UAE has moved to normalize relations with Israel, because the UAE is also on the same track as Saudi Arabia.
Right.
Modernize the country. This oil business may not last long. Renewable energy, people are choosing renewable energy. The vehicles will become, will work on hydrogen and stuff like that. So they have to look to the future.
Right.
And they also know, they realize that if they continue to be looked upon as an Islamic country with all these fellows, terrorists hanging around, or the source of conservative ideologies, is not going to work. So you've seen the tremendous change in thinking in the UAE, which has extended to normalizing relations with Israel, of which we have taken benefit, and we have this I2U2. Yeah. So Israel, India, US and UAE, to see if we can work together in this region. But much further away in Morocco, they have also normalized relations. But that's a deal. The Americans said, we recognize that Western Sahara belongs to you. You normalize with Israel, which they have done. So there is a big change, geopolitical change, economic change, societal change, cultural change in this region, which is good for us.
It's good for us.
Which is good for us.
We have excellent relations now with the Gulf nations. Is that a surprise?
Well, you know, the foundations of this were laid by the previous governments.
I see.
Because if you remember, Manmohan Singh had visited Saudi Arabia and UAE, but those were the very initial stages. And there might have been some concern that with the BJP and its image of Hindutva and persecution of Muslim minorities in India, we may have difficulties with these countries. On the contrary, and I think this goes to the tremendous credit of the present government, the manner in which they have solidified their ties, expanded their ties with these countries. And both Saudi Arabia and UAE have given Modi their highest honors. Plus, you know, the UAE is allowed a Hindu temple.
Yes, indeed.
The first country after Oman to do that. We signed an FTA with the UAE. With Saudi Arabia, our cooperation on counter-terrorism is very good. They have handed us, as I believe, terrorists sought by us.
Right.
So yes, I think we are on a very good wicket with them. And two areas in which progress will be made, and that will tie us even further together, is defense.
Defense, right.
You know, our air chief, military chief, for the first time visited Saudi Arabia. We've had air exercises with UAE. They are interested, it hasn't really picked up yet. They are interested in investing in our Atmanirbhar stuff in the defense, and then buy those products from us. They don't want to rely on the Americans and others. And of course, our products are cheaper, and now we are in that market. Our army chief went and addressed the Saudi Military Academy. Unthinkable at a time when the Pakistanis were providing physical security to the Saudi regime. Second is food security. Actually, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, especially UAE, wants to create a food corridor where they produce here, we produce here, and it is sold to the UAE because they need food. So there's a tremendous possibility there in the future.
I see. Now, when it comes to China and Russia, they were able to resolve their border dispute, the Ussuri River issue. Why can't India and China do the same? What is stopping India and China from demarcating the India-Tibet border? We've had, I don't know how many rounds of talks. So why isn't that happening?
See, China has views on sovereignty which are based on the unilateral understanding of where the border should be. I remember when they got this ruling from the arbitration court on the South China Sea issue, on the 9-dash line and everything else. The court ruled altogether against them. And Yang Jiechi at that time said that China will not yield an inch of territory bequeathed to it by its ancestors.
I see.
And I had written at that time that this is they're making a new international law of their own making. That if something has been bequeathed to you by your ancestors, you have a sovereign right on that. So then let every country look at what happened in the past in terms of change of borders and then redraw the borders again. It's absurd.
Yes.
This is what their view is. And Xi Jinping and others, they are so uncompromising on sovereignty issues. That's one. The other is Tibet.
Yes.
I don't know why they feel insecure in Tibet. In 1954, we agreed that Tibet is part of China.
Mr. Vajpayee also agreed.
I was foreign secretary then. I know what happened then.
Okay.
That was reiteration of the past position. There is no threat that we pose to Tibet. There is no terrorism in Tibet, which is supported from the outside, like the cross-border terrorism between Pakistan and us. There is no cross-border terrorism between India and Tibet. So why do they need to militarize Tibet the way they are, the way they are doing? Why do they consider India a threat? Threat to what? There are 2-3 things. One is that in order to keep a hold over Tibet, they want to tell the Tibetans that we are protectors of your territorial sovereignty than the Dalai Lama has ever been, because we claim the whole of Arunachal Pradesh on your behalf.
Okay.
It's your territory.
I see.
That kind of stuff. To build a category of Tibetans who can then be built up as supporters of China, and therefore helping them to control Tibet, and then satisfying their nationalist ambitions that we are fighting on your behalf by insisting that these Tibetan territories, your territories, should be returned to you. That is the second. But more important than this is that the Chinese know that the only country that can stand up to them in Asia is India.
Yes.
Right? Japan, South Korea and all, they can't.
Right.
They can flex muscles a little bit because of the Americans and their alliance. Otherwise, which ASEAN countries cannot. So which country can, in terms of size, demography, military power, economic power, cultural power, civilizational power, is India. And if you look at the history of Asia, Southeast Asia has far greater visible impact of Indian culture than Chinese culture.
Indeed. Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So they want to keep India under check and under pressure. Retard India's regional profile, global profile, build up Pakistan against us, neutralize us strategically so that we keep bogged down in Indian subcontinent, so that they have a free run of Asia and elsewhere. They also see that India is a part of the Western world in some sense, because we are a democracy, we're English speaking, our elites are tied to those countries, this and that. And therefore, India can become a threat, as they probably now realize with the Quad and Indo-Pacific and everything else, that India is becoming more of a challenge. So how to keep India under pressure? That is another thing that they have in mind. The other is that the illogic, the lack of logic in their position. They've accepted the McMahon line in Myanmar, but they won't accept it here.
Indeed, yes.
They won't accept it here. They say, no, at the minimum, you should give us Tawang. Tai Bingo, after retirement, years after retirement, made the statement, we can solve the border dispute, but India has to give us Tawang. So I have been saying, and I've been writing on this also, that in 1962, they had Tawang under their control.
They gave it up.
They gave it up.
Yes.
They didn't give up territory in Ladakh. So what was the compulsion to give up Tawang if they really believed their legal and political case was strong?
Indeed. Yes.
But they gave it up. Now what they gave up, they want to retrieve through negotiations. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So in Ladakh, the argument is that they want to protect that Exai road, but the Exai road is no longer very critical in terms of strategy. At one time, the only access to Tibet was through that area.
They have rail line now.
Now, they got rail line and everything else, so it's not critical. But they have this the narrative that they want to protect that, and hence the Depsang plain. They want to block up patrolling and stuff. Plus, of course, pincer movement, Pakistan on that side, China on this side. Basically, what they want is to go back to the 1959 line, unilaterally drawn by them as their line of actual control. And the latest moves have been in that direction, though they have been repelled and therefore have been agreed. They've been forced to agree to a buffer kind of a zone. And finally, they don't want to have this agreement because then it changes their entire policy in South Asia. I don't like that term South Asia. I try to avoid Indian subcontinent. Because then they have to distance themselves from Pakistan. Then India becomes the partner. So the entire complexion of politics changes. Then how do they keep Pakistan as a strategic barrier to India if they sort of make up with India? So it's very, very complex. Their thinking is very unclear as to, unlike in India or in other countries, a lot of discussion, open discussion, variety of views expressed, given different kind of reasoning, and an outside observer looks at all this information and try and make some sense as to where the truth may be. But in China, it's not impossible because they all sing the same tune. So, although mind you, many of their articles that they write, I've seen them by universities and all, they're very well written, very logical, rational, very well written. But the fundamental line is the same. That it is not in the interest of China to make peace with India, it's in the interest of India to make peace with China on China's terms. This is what their line is.
Right. You mentioned Brzezinski in his book, I think it was written in the 90s. He mentioned three major threats for the US. One is Russia and Ukraine, detaching Ukraine from Russia. One was China, preventing the rise of China. The third was maybe Islam. There was no mention of India. And there's never been any mention of India in the 1980s, 1990s as a future potential competitor. But today, India is finally rising. For the first time, it's leaving behind some of its mediocrity. Will the West rise, welcome a future rise of India, or is the US already seeing India as a future threat?
I think any power which is the dominating one will not like another dominating power to appear on the international horizon. In fact, if you look at American literature and their documents, they issue strategic documents, they very clearly say that they will not allow another dominant power to rise to challenge US power. That is their largest strategy. And what they've been doing all along is that even countries which have had a past of great power, like the British imperial power, the French also in their own way, stuff like that, they're all under their control.
Yes.
So India is not under their control. Right from the time when we were weak, we were actually dependent a lot on others to even survive the food grains that they gave us and stuff like that. But we maintained our non-alignment posture. And they realized that India will not ever be an alliance member. It will be an independent power. So they have to assess what does India as an independent strategic power which believes in this strategic autonomy, which will follow us to the extent that it is in their national interest, but not when it is not in their national interest. How do we look at this power? If I were to look at it as a rational American, I would say that India is a safe bet. India has no historical wrongs to be righted. If we had an historical wrong to be righted, we wouldn't have continue to be a member of the Commonwealth right after independence and make the outgoing Viceroy the first Governor General of India. Unlike the Chinese, 100 years of this, we want to undo that, and the historical wrongs have to be righted. We are not revanchists. We don't seek revenge. Number two, our record as a country. We've not invaded anyone. We've not sought anybody's territory. We've not sent our military forces here and there. Unlike China, the sort of things that they're doing now, or other countries. So India's record, its behavior, thinking of its ruling classes, its public, is not based on power politics and expanding India's power profile in the world in the sense of dominating and conquering others. Thirdly, we are a democracy not because the West wanted us to be, but we are a democracy. We are an open society, and they understand us, they comprehend us, and as a democracy, they can predict our behavior in international relations, unlike in the case of China. So we are not a closed book. We're totally open to the West, our media, the social media, the Chinese block all Western social media, this and that. So the democratic angle is important in that sense of giving a sense of reassurance that we believe at the end of the day in the same kind of way that human society should function. So we don't want to surprise you. And then, of course, the Indian diaspora in the United States, the role that they played domestically. Look at the manner in which the top US social media firms or technology firms are headed by Indian CEOs. More and more Indians are now getting into the administration. Vice President is half Indian. There are some congressmen also are of Indian origin. A lot of staffers in the Congress are of Indian origin. A lot of people in the administration, especially under the present Democratic administration, are of Indian origin. Not that it helps us in any great way, but
it does not.
But they're there. In the sense there's familiarity.
Yes.
So, and then I would say that, look, so long as China remains a threat, there is a country in Asia, a peer of China in many ways, which also feels threatened by China. So do we have a community of interest? Yes, we have. Should we strengthen that country to not to give it the power to dominate others, but to give it the power to resist China? So should we do it? A rational view would be yes, give it. If there are certain technologies, platforms that India would need, underwater domain awareness, or maritime technologies, ISR help in that. If this helps India to meet the Chinese threat, so let's do it. But where the Americans make a mistake is that they can't think beyond an alliance. Now, if we do this, but then you have to be an ally. Then you have to do what we say. And they can't tolerate easily a country saying that we don't agree with you, as is happening in the case of Ukraine. They're unhappy with the position, but they've accepted it in the larger political interests that they have, especially the China factor. Now, they keep, of course, weapons against us in order to warn us that we can create trouble for you.
Yes.
And that's the human rights issue, the democracy issue, Freedom House and VDEM and Reporters Sans Frontier and this and that, backsliding of Indian democracy, persecution of Muslim minorities, internet shutdowns. Even if something happens in one corner of India, it becomes an issue.
Yeah.
The United States. The latest State Department report is terrible, unacceptable. Where an unnamed senior official, he said that the Holocaust Museum in Washington is worried about the situation in India and the possibility of mass killings. And I tweeted yesterday that our reaction is very mild. This is unacceptable. And then Soros and this and that getting into the game. Fortunately, at the administration level, there's a difference in approach. We have the national security advisors having this big powwow with business people from both sides to develop cooperation in the emerging critical technologies, ICET, that we have formed. Biden is now inviting our Prime Minister for a state visit. We have a whole range of dialogues on so many other issues. Renewable energy, green hydrogen, transition, energy transition, climate change, terrorism, and stuff like that. So there are a lot of positives in the relationship which are being built at the administration level. But within the larger deep state, there are elements that are actually keeping us on the defensive,
Right.
and warning us that they can destabilize us from within and make governance difficult. Right. Now, there are some people who say, it may not be entirely true of the Americans, but could be of the West in general, but Americans primarily, that their game plan would be that BJP doesn't get full majority next time.
That's what I was about to ask you, actually.
And that if there's a coalition government, if the BJP is weakened, the country will be easier to handle.
Indeed.
The Modi is too strong a leader. And I think all these attacks that we are getting on other fronts is part of that.
Right. So there could be US interference in India.
Well, actually, if you ask me, these reports is interference. What else is it?
Indeed, yes.
It is interference. I mean, it's total disrespect for our democracy.
Yes.
And look at their own democracy. Far worse things are happening in the United States. But they have the arrogance of power that they can do what they want. And they're not answerable to anybody, but others must be answerable to them. I feel very resentful at the latest report that has come. Holocaust Museum, mass killing. What world are they thinking of?
Indeed. So, sir, you've been a diplomat for much of your life. You have experienced a lot. What have been some of the most memorable experiences for you as a diplomat?
Very difficult to say. It depends on what domain, in what context. Firstly, I think the career itself is very, very enjoyable. Very enjoyable. If I had to do it again, I'll do it again. In the sense that exposure to the world, exposure to foreign languages, dealing with the issues relating to India. Even when you go abroad as a young officer, as I did to France in 1968, they think you represent India, and you are callow. You don't have, unless you've got a PhD already. And, you can't answer every question. How do you deal with poverty in India? Your population problem. You're this. You're that. You're supposed to answer all these questions and satisfy your interlocutors. So you become a spokesman for India right from a very young age. In a sense, therefore, largely speaking, it may not be true of some people here or there. The service ingrains a sense of patriotism in you, because India has always been under attack. Right. So even now it's under attack, but less so. But all along we've been under attack. All the time, human rights, Kashmir, this, that. That is the other satisfying part, that you defend your country.
Right.
The other is that at a very young age, since you represent India, you deal with the levels which are far higher than you socially, politically, and otherwise, economically. You can, for example, when I was a very young officer in France, and Mrs. Gandhi came to lobby for international support for the Bangladesh crisis.
Oh.
I was the only chap with her when she met President Pompidou, when she went Prime Minister Shawan Delmas. So all the others, P.N. Aksar, T.N. Call, always running after me, kya hua, kya, batao mujhe, batao mujhe. So, that kind of thing.
I see.
You get a lot of exposure even when you are very, very young. And then when you're an ambassador, then especially in a big country, then there's a lot of burden on you. When I was Deputy Chief of Mission, effectively, I was running the mission in Washington. And that was the worst period that we had, because the Americans had said openly and officially that our goal is to freeze and eliminate your nuclear program. We had to fight against that. I had to fight against that constantly. Robin Raffel, I don't know if you know her name, she was the Assistant Secretary. She started questioning the instrument of accession to Jammu and Kashmir.
She was very pro-Pakistan, wasn't she?
She reopened that and that sort of thing. So, in that sense, from my point of view, productive part, one of the most productive part, yes, one of the two, was my tenure in Washington. The second, very productive but most enjoyable, was my ambassadorship to France. I was there when we did our nuclear tests. I was the one who initiated the strategic dialogue between the two countries, and obtained a French support. It's the only country that didn't sanction us.
Yes.
Plus all the other pleasures of being in a country like France. Russia was very satisfying from a very different angle, because the defense ties with Russia are very critical.
Yes.
And very sensitive. And that gave me an insight into defense matters, which sitting in the Ministry of External Affairs and ambassadorships elsewhere you don't get. Because this is an area which is dealt with by our defense ministry to the exclusion of the Ministry of External Affairs. So sitting in Delhi, except at the minister's level, you may get some understanding, but once you're ambassador in Russia, then they have to go through you. So that was very satisfying in its own way. But there are other pleasures. I was in Tanzania, in all the game parks.
I see.
Superb experience. Serengeti,
Serengeti, yes.
What have you. Nepal was a very fascinating experience, because I was Chargé d'Affaires for a very long time. Very difficult country to deal with. The most difficult neighbor we have. But Pakistan we know. But Nepal is, one assumes that Nepal is like us, is friendly, is this and that. Very difficult neighbor.
I see.
And King Birendra was in power. Big challenge. It was very rewarding in its own way.
Right. My final question for you today is, what advice would you give to young people of today? Just generally, not from diplomacy's perspective or anything. Overall, what advice would you give to young people?
Remain yourself, remain Indian. Don't absorb these Western ideas and get carried away by them. You're distorting your own personalities, your thinking, your culture. This is one of the oldest civilizations of the world. Remain rooted in that. Whatever positives you can get from other countries, okay, fine, you can absorb, but lose your identity. And I have a feeling that the younger generation is losing their Indian identity. Whether it's the fault in our education system or in parenting of children, whatever the reason. Number two, be nationalistic, not in the sense of, in the wrong sense, because the word nationalism now has acquired overtones which are negative. Immediately Nazism, fascism. It's not that. It's just your country. Build your country. Don't be the plaything of foreign interests. And I find a lot of people in our younger generation don't have that sense of commitment to the country. And unfortunately, therefore, those who have, immediately they are classified in a certain way. So that itself becomes a social problem. You can't go around saying that I'm a proud Hindu or a proud Indian, because then somebody will say, "Arey, ye to bhakt hai." But then the point is, we are an open country, we are a democracy, we are open to all influences. The American influence through the diaspora is very strong, through the British, from Britain is very strong. We don't have the kind of educational system where it is drilled into us to think of ourselves as Indian first. We have to rewrite aspects of our history to actually have a proper sense of who we are. So there it is, but it's a tall task, very difficult task, and we are a divided society, unfortunately. And the divisions are sharpening in some ways, but then there it is.
Dr. Sibal, thank you so much for such an extensive and fascinating conversation. I have 1,000 more questions which I would like to ask you, but I'll end it over here today. Thank you so much, sir. I hope you really enjoyed this conversation and gained something of genuine value from it. Subscribe now. Thank you, and I'll see you soon.